A very good afternoon to you all. I apologise. My limited linguistic skills mean that I have to speak in English, so if that doesn't float your boat, I won't be upset if you make your exit now. So I'm going to talk about upset prevention and recovery training, which is a very broad subject, so we're only going to look at some highlights of that today. And we're going to compare regulatory requirements versus best practice. A little bit about us. We basically specialize in delivering turnkey and bespoke upset prevention recovery training based in the UK down at Goodwood. We do lots of different sorts of UPRT across all business, aviation business sectors. And all of our instructors are ex-military pilots, and nearly all of them are either training captains or sim trainers, and usually both. My background, I'm ex-Air Force as well, was lucky enough to run the Empire Test Pilot School for Kinetic at Boscombe Down. And usually I spent 12 years in investment banking, don't hate me, and specialised in risk management, and that's given me a slightly different approach to how we approach risk. And we've been delivering UPRT. I'm also fortunate enough to be on the EASA working group that's developing the existing and upcoming regulations around UPRT. So, if you look at that list, you'll see an awful lot of regulations around UPRT. I'm going to focus on the EASA ones. And it has to be said that for Europe, EASA has made a very good start on mandating what's going to be required in UPRT, initially through the paper that went out back in 2015. But now there's two groups looking at on-aircraft and simulator UPRT. And the main parts of this is mandatory academic on-aircraft and simulator UPRT for pilots. Some of that's already in place. The mandatory on-aircraft stuff is going to come in April next year. So, there's a lot of good stuff out there. It will get better, but there are some limitations. This is not intended in any way to be a criticism of the regulations. By definition, when you put regulations together, you get a bunch of experts in a room, and they sit down, and they're very well intentioned, but the outcome of rulemaking by committee isn't necessarily always as practical as it might be. And also you have to look at, in many cases, the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to look at some places where existing practice is better than requirements, and also a few places where operators, airlines are possibly paying lip service to the existing regulations. So this is what we're talking about. This is the standard result of a flight upset resulting from a loss of control in flight. And this continues to be the largest single cause of accidents and fatalities in commercial aviation. You can look on the board there. The largest one is loss of control in flight, and the next two together are still smaller than loss of control in flight. So this continues to be a very real issue. The very sad thing about these accidents are those accidents resulting from a loss of control in flight is that in 80% of those accidents, the airplane was still flyable. Okay, so that's a failure in training. It might be a failure in culture, but it's certainly a failure. If the airplane was still flying in 4/5 of those occasions, then we're still doing something wrong. Just want to mention briefly that we don't think UPRT should be considered in isolation. It should be integrated across the whole training spectrum, and it really shouldn't be looked at as just a standalone bolt-on requirement. So for those of you less familiar with upset prevention recovery training, or UPRT, we basically have three layers. We talk about three layers of protection. The first layer, and the most important layer, is to just avoid it in the first place. If you don't have a flight upset, then you don't need to do anything clever about it. The next level of protection, if you like, is to be able to recognize it early, and we'll talk about this. And it's only if you blow through those two layers of protection that you actually have to carry out some recovery action. It's widely accepted the most effective UPRT training covers the three main areas. So academic, FSTDs, that's flight sims, I'll call that sims going forward, and on-aircraft UPRT. All of those have benefits and weaknesses. Let's look at academic knowledge first. The regulators do require that commercial pilots undergo academic training around UPRT. However, it continues to be the case when we have commercial pilots come through our academy that the level of academic knowledge for existing pilots continues to be very poor, with two main areas of weakness that we see a lot. One is an understanding of angle of attack, and lots of people will look at that diagram there and see how and appreciate how angle of attack is nothing to do with the pitch level of the wing and everything to do with the relative airflow over the wing. And the other area where people are weak is in terms of their knowledge around high-level aerodynamics. Few people actually fly their airplane at high level. Yeah, you probably should occasionally, or at least whenever you can. I think it's fair to say on the simulator side, some advocates of UPRT claim that sims aren't terribly useful. They can actually provide excellent training for UPRT. Anybody who says that they're not useful for UPRT isn't using them properly, but they do have material limitations, and these aren't always particularly appreciated by training organizations. The UPRT sim training program needs to be well designed, it needs to be integrated with everything else. Again, as part of every sim exercise, not just say, we've finished everything else, now we're going to do 20 minutes on upset training. I know standardization is a challenge whenever we look at training, but let me just share one of my pet hates with you. One of the airlines we worked with, we sat down with their training standards guys and we put together a pretty good, in fact I think it was a very good training program to teach upset recovery on their recurrent sim training. However, they only gave quite general directions. So taking one example, if you have an airplane, forgive my use of hands here, if you have an airplane in a nose-up situation like this, and let's assume, for sake of argument, you've lost elevator authority, they were saying, if you lose elevator authority, then put rudder on and get the nose to come down like this. Now, regardless of whether that's a good idea or not, and that wasn't an ultimate high idea, when I went in to have a look at what the TRIs were delivering, I heard three different stories. One chap said, this is what you always do. One chap says, this is a handling exercise. One chap says something completely different. Okay, so if you decide you're going to do some sort of training, you have to be pretty prescriptive to make sure that the message gets through, because otherwise people go away with completely different ideas. The trainers have to understand the limitations of the sim. You have to understand not just the technical limitations of the sim, including the validated training envelope, but also the fact that we all know that from a psychological and physiological perspective, the sim can't represent what happens in the real world. Trainers need to be trained properly. That's probably self-evident. A lot of trainers, TRIs and some TREs who are delivering upset training in the sim have never been beyond 30 degrees angle of bank themselves, and it's quite hard to actually relay those physiological factors that the pilots training in the sim are going to experience. And I think the single largest thing that we've seen as a deficiency in simulator trainers is their understanding of human factors and CRM as it pertains to UPRT. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time on, and I think a lot of our clients have taken away in terms of the value of proper training. What do I mean by this? Let's have a chat. Okay, to recognize a flight upset, and I'm not going to define an upset, but to recognize when things are abnormal, you have to know when things are normal. Okay, so let's take a random example. If you're flying an Airbus and you lose your speed indicator, what does cruise look like? 37,000 feet. Well, probably 2.5 degrees nose up, 83% N1, something thereabouts. Going back to basics of power plus attitude equals performance. Yeah, so basic flying skills going to help people. You ask a lot of commercial pilots, you're on your descent on the way down to the airport, what does the attitude look like? I don't know, I follow the flight directors. And improving people's knowledge around what actually things look like means when you get to a very obvious thing like that, those pictures clearly demonstrate a flight upset, but they've probably gone through some process, they will have gone through a process before that, where it would have been easier to make a small correction to recover things. I'm looking at the time. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on crew resource management, but it is a very important part of the UPRT training program, and it's something that the regulators don't really spend enough time on. I just want to talk about shared mental model. Okay, so in terms of communication between the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring, can't stress enough how important that is, as well as compliance with standard operating procedures. So let's have a look at this picture then. Probably recognize this from the AirAsia crash. So starting off with the PFD, a bit of a misleading PFD that, isn't it? If you just look at the attitude, then it's wings level, that sounds kind of nice, that kind of normal flight. But then you look at the speed tape and the height tape, speed is very low and descending with a massive rate of descent. What communication is happening here between the two pilots? The guy on the left-hand side has got full forward stick and right aileron. Guy on the right-hand side has got full back stick and a tiny bit of right aileron. The crew clearly not communicating with each other. Unfortunately, of course, being an Airbus, the airplane takes the aggregated input of the two sets of flight controls, and as a result, they don't actually correct what's going on. So making sure you have decent communication is so essential, and making sure that you can do that in an emergency. Too much of UPRT looks at individual pilot recovery and doesn't look at how the team manage. Let's take another example. That's a horrible couple of PFDs to get. This actually happened, and it started off briefing at top of drop with the captain suddenly looking at his PFD and seeing 30 degrees nose up. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to react. What he did was to push the stick forward and score -1.5 G, after which I suspect they're probably so distracted they had very little chance of doing anything in any case. But in terms of figuring out what to do in that situation, and particularly if you allow it to develop in the situation shown here, is absolutely critical. The industry as a whole talks about startle, and the regulators use this term all the way through, and the industry UPRT aid talks about startle. I think the industry has done itself a big disservice by talking about it as startle. Startle is something that happens in a horror film when someone jumps out of you or you see a bad guy or a monster. And in a very short period of time, you're absolutely fine. If you're just startled, if you're carrying out a motor task, you can normally get back onto whatever task you're doing after a very short period of time. And yet we've all seen in these accidents resulting from loss of control in flight, that hasn't happened. Why is that? It's because it's not startle. I would guess that people's faces are not reflecting startle. Yeah, let's go to the Air France example. This is a decision-making model, if you like. There are lots of decision-making models out there. The reason I like this one is because it goes from detect what's going on, you recognize what's happening, you recall how to deal with it, and then you then react and sort it out. In Air France, as with a lot of the flight upset accidents, people went straight from detect to react. And why did they do that? Well, it wasn't because they were startled, it's probably because they looked a bit more like this. That's not startle, that's fear. And fear can be seriously debilitating, okay? And the regulators as a whole kind of gloss over this a little bit. It's something we spend a lot of time talking about. Everybody responds differently. You've got some people who take to upset training very naturally, A lot of airline pilots haven't been beyond maybe 45 degrees of bank at any stage in their flying career, and therefore get very upset by this sort of stuff. And it's important when we deliver the training to develop an individual coping strategy. And this is partially why on-aircraft training is so critical. On-aircraft training, as I said, will be mandatory for all new pilots as of next year. And a lot of organizations, a lot of training schools are already doing this. We're certainly working with a number of training schools around this. And it gives you exposure to G-forces, both positive G, more than 1G, and less than 1G. Negative G is incredibly debilitating. Anything below 1G, people tend to get quite upset about. And exposure to startle as well. So that's one of the good things about on-aircraft. It makes the experience and the quality of the instructors essential. The regulators have mandated that people teaching on-aircraft UPRT need to have at least an aerobatic rating. Okay, so that's maybe 5 hours of aerobatics. Now, I put it to you that if you're a student and you're attending a flight upset training course on an airplane, you want the guy behind you to be very experienced, very capable, very good at aerobatics, and not getting upset at any stage. If your instructor starts screaming, that's clearly a bad thing. The regulators also say that the main benefit of on-aircraft training is the exposure to startle, to physiological factors, and the feeling G. We actually feel the regulators are missing a point there because a lot of the recovery actions are directly applicable to large airplanes. Yes, we're flying straight-wing, propeller, piston-driven airplanes, and most commercial pilots, certainly in the airlines, will be flying swept-wing jets with underslung engines with the inevitable pitch-up moment. But a lot of the stuff is quite pertinent, and the challenge and the very important part of the training is making sure that the training you deliver is read across to the large airplane when we do it on little airplanes. And the other thing that I want to stress around this is going back to basics. Getting back into a little airplane and flying it, maybe at VS1G plus 5 knots, and getting used to operating at the edges of the flight performance envelope is a really positive impact. A lot of you will have seen SAFO 17007 came out from the FAA beginning of this month, and what that does is encourages manual flying for airliners, but lots of people really don't encourage that. Okay, I'm very tight on time here, so what I'm going to do is hope that my butter works. Okay, let's skip over that. So, the regulators give us, in their Bible, 5 what they call recovery templates. Okay, so in these 5 scenarios, they give us a recovery template, each of which is different, and we think this is a little bit silly, because by definition, as we've already said, if you are unfortunate enough to be in a position of flight upset, you're going to be behind the airplane. If you're sharp and bright and aware, a flight upset is far less likely to happen. Okay, so we, in terms of delivering resilience, want to have a simple method that people can remember to get them out of each of those 5 scenarios. I'm jumping ahead to this. We're talking about UPRT. We use UPRT as our little aid memoir. So if you recognize the upset, the first thing you need to do in all upsets is to push, okay? By pushing, we mean putting the control column centrally forward. What's that going to do for us? It's going to reduce the angle of attack and therefore move the airplane away from the stall. If you're less than 1G, it's going to reduce the stalling speed, and it's also going to it's going to improve the effectiveness of your flight controls. It's always a good thing to do. Next thing you're going to do is roll your wings level with the horizon, wherever the nearest horizon is. So your lift vector is pointing straight up, away from gravity. And then you're going to do something with thrust, depending on your airplane, depending where your engines are. Normally, if you're fast, you'll reduce your power. If you're slow, you'll increase power. Counterintuitively, if you've got an underslung engines and your nose high, you may have to reduce the thrust to help get the nose down. But if you use push, roll, thrust in every situation, that's going to get you out of every situation. I'm not going to have time to talk about resilience, so I'm going to tease you with some slides I'm not going to talk about. But basically, we talk about building layers of protection. Okay, and at the bottom of our layers of protection, if you haven't noticed the event happening, if you've gone into the upset, if you haven't been able to diagnose it, if you haven't been able to apply your QRH or the manufacturer's recovery, and you can't even remember push, roll, thrust, then the last thing you're going to do, the last action in our layers of protection through this coping funnel is to push. Thank you very much for your time, guys. I'm around if anybody would like to come and chat about any UPRT-related issues. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Gostaríamos agora de